It was 6:22 a.m. on February 8, 1945, when Lance Corporal Arthur Hale pressed his cheek against the cold wood of a shattered farmhouse window overlooking the fog-soaked edge of the Reichswald Forest. Operation Veritable had begun 2 days earlier, and the forest felt like it wanted to swallow every man who entered it. Hale was 24, 6 months into combat, and already weathered in the eyes. He had 11 confirmed kills, all hard-earned. But not once, not a single time, had he seen a German sniper before the first round came for him. And on this morning, just like the others, a crack split the mist as a round punched through the frame inches from his temple, showering him with splinters. He ducked instinctively, heart hammering, teeth clenched. He was always behind. Always reacting. Always a half-second too slow. My name is Berg, and this is Firepower World War II. If stories like this matter to you, forgotten ingenuity, frontline grit, the truth behind the weapons and the men, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more ahead. Hale steadied his breath, but the cold refused to leave him. The Reichswald was the kind of battlefield that punished anyone who tried to predict it. Dense green walls, low visibility, German sharpshooters dug into spider holes with fields of fire barely 30 yards across. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division was pushing east under constant pressure. Trees exploded without warning. Mud swallowed boots whole. Every few minutes another man screamed for a medic. The Germans had shaped the forest into a maze, and their snipers understood its geometry long before the Canadians stepped foot inside. Hale's assignment was simple in theory: find the men who were killing his comrades and silence them before they struck again. Counter-sniper duty. The kind of work that demanded patience, nerves of iron, and a little luck. But luck had turned its back on them out here. The German marksmen had pre-sighted hides, perfect camouflage, and countless narrow sight lines that made detecting them nearly impossible. The math was cruel. In 7 out of 10 engagements, the Germans fired first. And whoever fired first almost always won. Hale's battalion had seen casualties rise by 40% in just a week, most of them clean head or throat shots. It was a pattern, an ugly, repeating rhythm that he could almost feel before it happened. They would push past a certain ditch line or crest a small ridge, and somewhere out in the blur of trees, a muzzle glint or a tiny shift was all that was needed. A single shot. A man falls. Confusion. Another shot. Another fall. And then, as quickly as they appeared, the enemy vanished again. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't inexperience. It was structural. The doctrine itself was failing them. British and Canadian manuals encouraged snipers to observe from high ground or overwatch positions. But in the Reichswald, there was no high ground. The dense woods erased vantage points. Hale's number 4 MKIT, with its excellent number 32 scope, offered clarity, but the narrow field of view meant he had to expose more of himself than was wise. Spotting was lethal if you didn't already know where to look. He learned that the hard way with Private Monroe, the 19-year-old from Ontario who had survived the war's worst training days with a grin. They were easing forward through a flooded trench when Monroe whispered that he saw something ahead, something flicker. Before Hale could glass the area, a round ripped through Monroe's collarbone and spun him backward. Hale dragged him behind a root cluster, but the medic shook his head before even opening the field dressing. Monroe never knew what hit him. Hale didn't either. That was the worst part. A few days later, Sergeant Thompson, the carpenter from Halifax who carried photos of his 2 daughters in his chest pocket, died almost the same way. A single round slipped through a gap in the sandbags at their observation post, hitting him square in the throat. The pattern repeated again. And again. Then came Corporal Ellis, quiet, sharp-eyed, one of the best shooters in the division. He peeked for 3 seconds, maybe less, over a ridge to get a bearing. A flash. A crack. Hale watched Ellis collapse, rifle sliding from his hands as if someone had unplugged his soul. Each death carved deeper into Hale than the last. He wasn't just losing men. He was losing good men. Skilled men. Men who trusted him. He felt the weight of every failure pressing harder on his ribs, making every breath feel earned. Every time he closed his eyes at night, he saw the same question echoing behind his eyelids. How do you fight a sniper you never see? How do you win a duel with someone who already has the crosshairs on you before you even shoulder your weapon? It was a puzzle with no answer. A trap with no way out. The standard equipment wasn't the problem, the doctrine was. The scope's narrow field meant Hale had to scan slowly, exposing himself with every tiny adjustment. And the enemy only needed a fraction of a second to take advantage. The realization sank into him with a bitterness he hated to admit. If nothing changed, more men would die. And one of those men might be him. That thought was still crawling through his mind the next morning as he stood beside a rain barrel behind their makeshift bunker, splashing freezing water onto his face. He pulled out his small metal field mirror, cracked at the top corner from a fall 2 months earlier. As he wiped the surface, the rising sun bounced off it, throwing a distorted reflection of the tree line behind him. He tilted it slightly. The reflection widened. He saw more than he ever could with his naked eyes. He saw movement far behind him that he would have otherwise missed, a pair of shadows shifting inside a dugout. He froze, stunned by the simplicity of it. The idea hit him with the force of a mortar blast. What if he could scan a wide angle without exposing himself at all? What if he could look before he looked? What if he could use this stupid, flimsy piece of mirror to counter men who'd spent their whole lives mastering the craft of not being seen? It was idiotic. Childish. Dangerous. Reflective surfaces were explicitly banned near frontline positions. One glint in the wrong direction and he'd give away his location quicker than waving a white flag. And if an officer caught him experimenting, he'd find himself reassigned or reprimanded. But the alternative was simple: keep watching men die. That night, long after the last artillery thuds rolled off into silence, Hale slipped into an abandoned barn near their line. Rain dripped through the roof. The wind rattled the broken planks. He laid out the mirror, some tape, a broken bayonet scabbard, and a burned-out lamp. He worked by moonlight, attaching, adjusting, shifting angles. The first attempt sent a bright flash across the rafters. He cursed and wiped soot from a lantern chimney onto the mirror's back to dull the glare. The second attempt shook too much. The third didn't cover enough angle. He scratched the mirror's surface lightly to break up sharp reflections. He tightened the tape. He tested the balance. He adjusted again. Each modification felt like one more small rebellion against the rulebook that was failing them. Finally, after an hour of fighting frustration and fatigue, he angled the improvised device toward a crack in the barn wall. Through the reflection he could see nearly 180 degrees of the field outside. Not sharp. Not perfect. But enough to sense movement. Enough to locate a hide before risking a bullet. Enough to change something. He exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was the sense that he might have stumbled into a lifeline. The next morning, Hale tucked the improvised mirror rig into his kit as naturally as if it were standard issue, though his chest tightened every time a sergeant or officer walked past. The forest was waking up slowly, fog sliding between trees like pale smoke. His unit was preparing to push another 200 yards toward higher ground where German resistance had been heaviest. Hale watched the men check rifles, adjust straps, pass quiet jokes to mask the dread that always came before a push. He looked at their faces, faces he knew well, faces that had stared too often into the barrel of an unseen rifle. His throat tightened as he thought about Monroe, Thompson, Ellis. He would not lose more if there was a way to prevent it. He moved ahead of the main section, slipping into a shallow depression near the tree line. The ground was cold, slick with frozen mud. He lay flat, eased the mirror rig upward on the scabbard, and angled it just enough to catch the forest edge without sending any bright reflection back. The image was distorted, rough, but wide. Much wider than what he'd ever had the chance to see before exposing even a sliver of his head. At first, nothing. Just gray shapes blending with the trees, water dripping in slow beads from bare branches. But Hale waited, breathing through his nose, pulse steadying as he scanned. A few seconds passed. Then something shifted, subtle, barely there. A sliver of burlap that had seemed still now twitched, caught by a brief stir of wind. It was exactly the kind of movement a man would make when tightening his grip or shifting his weight. The kind you would miss with naked eyes. The kind you'd need to expose your skull for with a scope. Hale froze the mirror. Watched. Confirmed. Then lowered the rig, rolled slightly to his right, brought the Lee Enfield No. 4 MKIT to his shoulder, and aimed just left of where the burlap movement had been. He exhaled and squeezed. The shot cracked through the morning stillness, sharp and final. And for the first time in weeks, the silence afterward wasn't followed by a retaliatory shot. Instead, the distant MG-42 position that had been firing sporadically all morning went dead quiet. Hale watched through the scope for another minute, but there was no return fire, no shift, no counter. He had beaten the pattern. He had seen the enemy first. It was one kill, just one, but it felt like he had turned gravity upside down. When he returned to the line, the men noticed the difference immediately. Someone said he looked lighter, someone else asked if he'd found the bastard early this time, and Hale simply nodded. He wasn't ready to reveal anything yet, not until he was sure it was more than a fluke. But that evening, after another small firefight broke out and ended with fewer casualties than expected, Corporal Davies approached him privately. "What the hell did you do today, Art?" Davies whispered, glancing around as if eavesdroppers lurked behind crates. "You hit that first sniper clean. No one's done that in this forest in weeks. You found him before he fired, didn't you?" Hale hesitated, then reached into his kit and pulled out the mirror rig. Davies stared at it, brow furrowing as if Hale had just shown him a child's toy. Then his eyes widened. "You're using a periscope," Davies breathed. "A bloody homemade periscope." Hale corrected him gently. "A way to see without being seen." Davies turned it over, amazed. "You know you can get court-martialed for carrying something reflective that close to the line." "I know," Hale said calmly. "But it works." Davies ran a thumb over the scratched surface. "Art, you realize what this means? You realize how many men we've lost because we couldn't look without getting our faces blown off?" Hale nodded. He had been thinking the exact same thing since the moment he squeezed the tape around the scabbard in the barn. By dawn, half the snipers in the battalion had heard rumors. By midday, 3 men approached Hale asking for him to just show quickly how you did it. And by evening, 6 more had cobbled together their own versions, some with broken vehicle mirrors, some with canteen lids polished and dulled, some with bits of British shaving mirrors bent around metal strips. Hale didn't instruct them formally, he just shared enough that they could copy his idea. It spread naturally, quietly, soldier to soldier. Within 48 hours, 12 snipers were using improvised mirror periscopes. And within 72 hours, the entire counter-sniper section began reporting something unusual: fewer surprise engagements. Fewer casualties. More first shots fired by Canadians instead of Germans. Numbers started shifting in ways officers couldn't ignore. Counter-sniper casualties fell by nearly 30% during the next advance. German kills dropped sharply. Enemy attempts to rotate hide positions or adjust angles were met with early detection every time. Hale's periscope rig allowed them to scan quickly, efficiently, and most importantly, safely. The battlefield felt different now. A kind of control had returned to the Canadians, a sense that they were no longer doomed to play the Germans' game. By the start of the next week, Hale noticed something else happening. Soldiers outside the sniper teams, riflemen, scouts, even machine gunners, began fashioning their own crude versions. Some used 2 broken pocket mirrors taped inside ration tins. Others welded thin slivers of metal to sticks. One engineer even cut and angled a motorcycle mirror to extend from behind cover. They weren't as effective as the sniper versions, but they worked well enough to spot movement before stepping into kill zones. And that's when the inevitable happened. During a morning inspection, Major Whitcomb, a stern British officer whose uniform looked perpetually overstarched, stopped dead in his tracks when he noticed Hale adjusting the mirror rig beside his rifle. The major narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. Hale's stomach dropped. Someone had finally noticed. "What precisely is this contraption, Lance Corporal?" Whitcomb asked, voice clipped and cold. Hale swallowed. "Improvised observation device, sir." "A reflective surface? At the front?" Whitcomb snapped. "Who authorized this?" Hale felt every pair of eyes in the trench turn toward him. Davy stiffened beside him. Hale braced himself for consequences he had fully expected from the moment he first taped the mirror to the scabbard. He opened his mouth to answer, but the major held up a hand. "Never mind." Whitcomb looked around quickly, then lowered his voice. "I've seen your section's casualty reports, Hale. And I've seen the Germans struggling to maintain their sniper dominance." Whitcomb leaned slightly closer. "It's effective. It's clever. Very clever. Keep it out of the official logs. And keep using it." The major straightened, eyes turned sharp once more, and barked, "Carry on," before walking away as though nothing had happened. Hale exhaled slowly. Davy slapped his shoulder with a grin. It wasn't permission, not formally. But it was protection. And in war, that was enough. The forest continued to churn with danger. The Germans adjusted tactics, shifting hides more frequently, firing from unexpected angles. But the mirror periscopes kept working, especially when 2 snipers coordinated, one scanning wide with the mirror, the other ready behind the scope. Their small teams moved like organisms now, covering more ground, detecting more threats, breaking the deadly rhythm that had cost them so many friends. With every advance, Hale felt something changing in him too. Confidence wasn't the right word, nothing about this forest allowed for that. But he felt purpose sharpening. He wasn't fighting blind anymore. He wasn't waiting to react. He was acting first. The men around him felt it too. His section no longer moved with the fear of unseen eyes pressing against their foreheads. They moved with a cautious, controlled anticipation. Hale could sense when they glanced at him during quiet moments an unspoken question in their eyes. "You see anything?" "We trust you." Hale's answer was always subtle, a slow shake of the head, or a pointed finger, or a quiet instruction. And each time his mirror caught a movement early, each time the number 4 MKIT fired first, he felt the weight of their losses ease just a little, a quiet repayment to the memories of Monroe, Thompson, and Ellis. As the battalion pressed deeper into the Reichswald, Hale's small act of defiance became a quiet evolution in how they fought. What had begun as a cracked shaving mirror taped to a scabbard was now reshaping entire engagements. Hale didn't let himself dwell on that. He just worked. Observed. Fired. protected the men he had left. And with each passing day, the homemade mirror rig felt less like an improvisation and more like a lifeline, one the Germans never saw coming. The last week of the push through the Reichswald felt like a blur stitched together by cold mornings, sudden firefights, and the quiet relief of catching threats before they struck. Hale's mirror rig had become as familiar to him as the weight of the number 4 MKIT in his hands. The rifle itself had always been his most trusted tool, the precision-built scope, the hand-selected barrels, the crisp trigger break. But now the mirror had become its necessary companion, the scout that watched the world before Hale exposed even the corner of an eye. Every day, the bond between those two simple pieces of equipment deepened, and with it, the trust of the men around him. But even life-saving ideas eventually meet the cold, heavy machinery of military bureaucracy. Word spread quietly from battalion to brigade. A staff captain had overheard enlisted men talking about Hale's trick. Then a signals officer mentioned seeing mirror rigs across multiple companies. And soon, a formal inquiry landed on Major Wickham's desk asking how unapproved reflective devices had made their way to the front line. Wickham summoned Hale with a tone that said he disliked the situation before it even began. Hale entered the command post, stiff-backed, expecting the conversation to pivot toward reprimand. The major paced behind a makeshift desk stacked with maps and casualty reports, jittering his fingers in annoyance. "Hale," Wickham began, "your little invention has caused quite a stir up the chain. Some are calling it reckless. Others are calling it unauthorized innovation. One colonel claims you've undermined standard doctrine." Hale held his posture, unsure if silence was safer than a defense that wouldn't matter. Wickham stopped pacing. "But then I'm given this," he said, tapping a thin report with the back of his hand. "Our sniper casualties have dropped dramatically in your sector. German sharpshooter fire has become sporadic. And operations in your corridor advance more quickly than projected. They want to know why." The major leaned forward, voice low. "I will handle the paperwork. What you need to understand is this: the army moves slowly, painfully slowly. It will never put its full weight behind something unless it can claim it came from a desk and not a barn floor." He paused, letting the meaning settle. "They won't credit you. They probably never will. But they will watch. And they will take notes. And if your idea keeps working, someone far above us will eventually pretend they thought of it first." Hale didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He cared little about credit. All he wanted was for his men to walk out of the forest alive. Wickham gave a faint, tired smile. "Keep doing what you're doing, Lance Corporal. And keep it quiet." With that, he dismissed Hale and returned to his mountain of reports. Hale stepped outside, inhaling the damp forest air with a sense of both relief and resignation. His contribution would never reach official logs. But out here, among the mud and shattered trees, the only recognition that mattered was the silent nod from a man who saw his next sunrise because Hale had seen danger first. The days that followed pushed the battalion deeper through German defenses. Hale and his team used the mirror rigs with growing confidence. As the mirror caught more early movements, tiny shifts in camouflage, faint glints of a rifle barrel, micro-motions of branches bending against the wrong weight, Hale realized the device was no longer just a workaround. It had become a doctrine of its own: see before being seen, skin without exposing, act before reacting. 2 weeks later, the Canadians finally punched through the last stretch of fortified positions and emerged from the forest into clearer ground. The sounds of war continued, but the constant fear of unseen eyes eased with the open sky. Hale felt a weight lift from his chest, a pressure he didn't even fully understand until it disappeared. When the war ended months later, Hale walked away quietly, like so many others who wanted nothing more than to go home. He returned to Ontario, to a quiet street lined with maple trees, and took up work as a machinist. He married a nurse he met at a community dance, raised 2 children, and lived the kind of life that made the war feel distant, like a memory preserved in old steel. But he kept a small wooden box under his bed. Inside was the cracked mirror, scratched and darkened with soot, still taped to the broken bayonet scabbard. Next to it, a faded photograph of his battalion taken during a rare moment of calm. Every year on February 8th, the anniversary of that morning in the Reichswald, Hale opened the box, held the mirror in his hands, and remembered the men who hadn't come home. He never once spoke of what he'd done or how many lives it likely saved. He simply told his son, when asked why he kept the broken thing, sometimes the smallest tool can change everything. Decades later, a military historian researching field modifications of the Lee Enfield No. 4 MKIT stumbled across a footnote buried in a yellowed after-action report. It mentioned unusual reflective observation methods used by an unnamed sniper team during Operation Veritable. Intrigued, the historian tracked down veterans and eventually found Hale's widow. She led him to the wooden box, still kept in a closet, still untouched since Hale's last February 8th ritual. The historian lifted the mirror gently, turning it under the light. Its rough scratches and improvised tape told a story more vivid than any official record. Hale's widow rested a hand over her heart. He never wanted praise, she said. He only wanted his boys to make it home. The historian wrote an article, small, published in an obscure journal, but it carried a truth absent from formal histories, that the most effective innovations often originate not from planning rooms or high command, but from desperate men, fighting impossible odds, who refuse to let their friends die if they can prevent it. Years later, visitors to a Canadian War Museum walked past a pristine Lee Enfield No. 4 MKIT, displayed under soft lights. The plaque beneath it praised factory tolerances, sniper doctrine, optical excellence. But nowhere did it mention the cracked mirror that had helped level the battlefield for a handful of men in a forest far from home. Nowhere did it mention Hale. But that is often how legacies survive, not in the official records, but in the quiet knowledge of those who care enough to look deeper. Most people will never hear the name Lance Corporal Arthur Hale. Most people will never know what he did. Now you do. And remembering it is a form of honoring him. If stories like this matter to you, stories of forgotten ingenuity, uncredited bravery, men who made the difference when the manuals failed, like this video and help keep these histories alive. Subscribe to the channel and join a community that refuses to let these stories fade. And tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Every voice helps preserve the past.